is Maryna.
And I'm Andrey. Welcome. We're back with a book review for you.
Yes, and you haven't told me much about this book yet.
I know. Just keeping it fresh for you and for our listeners.
Very intriguing. It's called Alliances, right?
That's right. It's called Alliances by Ard-Pieter de Man. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Published almost exactly 10 years ago, and I think it's still very relevant. Ard-Pieter is a professor of management studies at and this is going to be impossible for me to pronounce correctly, at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So basically, he's a professor at a very complicated university. He's authored and co-authored a number of books in the field of alliance and partner management, innovation, and organizational change.
All right. So, what can we learn from him that applies to tech alliances?
Well, let's see. There's a quote from the book that is central for me. It goes, "For the 21st century organization, having a smooth running internal structure is no longer sufficient. Its external relationships also need to be effectively organized." Right? A technology company is a pretty good example of a 21st century organization. I would argue that organizing external relationships has always been crucial, but we can leave that to one side and focus on Peter's actual approach to this external organization.
So, where do we begin?
First up, I like Peter's classification of the reasons for alliances, right? And there's a few. So from the top, spreading risks, access to technologies, pooling resources, especially to face increased competition, complementary products and services, customer demand, joint go-to-market, access to markets, in particular when you go international, and efficiency gains. So there are 8 scenarios here. And if you, your company, find yourself in any one of these, making alliances seems to be the right choice for you.
Okay. So it seems pretty hard to find a business outside of all 8 of these scenarios.
My point exactly. Alliances are a tool that you can apply appropriately and effectively at any stage in the business life cycle and in any environment.
All right. And?
Well, another key concept that Art Peter puts out there right at the beginning of the book is the controlled trust dilemma. In a way, this is a lens through which much of this book can be seen, because it allows you to both figure out what type of alliance you can get comfortable with before it starts, as well as to recognize the changes that need to happen in your alliance as it and its environment evolve.
I think I don't really get the idea. What's the dilemma?
Nothing too complicated. It's in the name. It's all about the type of control systems like contracts and governance that you want to put in place versus the amount of trust and alignment that exists between partners to allow for more nimble, even informal communication and decision making. I think, both you and I have seen examples that are closer to one or the other end of the spectrum. High control and low trust versus high trust and low control.
Let me think. I can think of a few. When you and I were building the tech alliance for our companies, I think we actually managed to shift it somewhere along the spectrum towards increased trust.
Precisely. I think so too. And here's some advice from Peter on how to evolve along that axis. Again, there's a bullet point list, so I'll go from the top. First up, rediscuss alignment and resources when new opportunities for growth and development emerge. Foster social bonds. We certainly did that. Complement specific targets with a shared vision. Always add mechanisms to amend existing agreements. Account for each other's communication preferences. Remember the platinum rule. Right, that's from me. I didn't invent the rule, but if in case you're not familiar with it, look it up. But in a nutshell, it's basically don't so much do to others as you'd like them to do unto you, which is the golden rule. Do to others as they would like to be done unto. So when you're communicating with somebody, don't communicate to them in the way that you like to be communicated at, but rather find out what they actually prefer. Then, moving down the list, include the implementation team in the design process. Align internal incentives with the alliance's goals. And that's a pretty tricky one. Try to have a clear working structure without too many separate working groups, although this is debatable. It depends on what you're trying to do, I would say. And try not to lump multiple goals together. So that's it. That's the list.
That's a lot. I particularly like the point about not lumping multiple goals because it is super important to keep focused. Plus, I have some questions about adding mechanism to amend existing agreements because from my point of view, it is always better to make things simpler and easier, avoiding building up too many processes. Am I wrong?
I would agree with that completely. What I would add is that sometimes if you're building the alliance based on a contract, or if at least a contract is included into the alliance somehow, if it does not include mechanisms like explicit ways to change it, I don't know, like there needs to be a 30-day notification or something like that. It can be something as simple as that, or maybe more complex. If you don't explicitly include this, then at the point when you're trying to change it, you will have to negotiate that again. And depending on the amount of trust that the alliance has and the conditions that the alliance is in, that could be tricky. So I think that's what he's getting at.
Okay.
Make sense?
Maybe I just need to read the book. Okay.
Well, maybe everybody should read the book. This is why we're doing this.
Right. And actually, I just want to add one more thing is about including the implementation team in the design process. I think it is a golden rule of any IT project. Or not? What do you think?
I know exactly. This is where we could discuss this endlessly in context of project management or whatever. But unfortunately, what we also tend to see is in many larger companies, there's a lot of fragmentation and silos that emerge. Like there is a team that is the, I don't know, the contract making team, like let's say the BD team, the business development team that goes out and establishes the relationship and agrees on who is going to do what and under what terms. And then they come back into the organization, for example, to the engineering org and say, hey, well, we've agreed with these people that this is what we're going to do. And then the engineering people look at them and go, you did what now? How? We're not able to do this. We can't work under this condition. I see that way too often, not to realize that this advice is actually needed.
I see. Because I believe that a good alliance manager is able to create great communication, not just between just companies, but also between the teams inside his own company, because that's really important for if you want to achieve a good result. And that's why it is really crucial to be able to communicate with implementation teams.
Yeah, spot on. So I think that's why he's including this, right? Including the implementation teams in the design process. Like, this is not the end of it, basically. Don't just include them in the implementation process. You should ideally be talking to them even before you start the alliance. Like, people that you make an alliance with, your product team to some degree should have some input on how the process looks like and what the criteria are and so on. Anyway,
I just feel a little bit sad because we all know how everything must be. And anyway, what happens during the implementation process is so sad.
well, look, what I can say is that this is the point why we're doing this analysis and reviews in order to share our experiences and sort of try to disseminate what we believe to be the best practices, be it in DevOps or, as is the case, maybe in tech alliances, which I think are very interrelated fields. Anyhow, with all that, we finally come to Ard-Pieter's pièce de résistance, the Alliance Design Framework. Like many centerpieces of someone's detailed theory, the framework is actually quite simple. At the top, so visualize this diagram. At the top, you have the strategic imperative, the thing that drives the partners into forming an alliance. This is supported by formal and informal mechanisms. We've discussed this a little bit already in terms of communication and stuff. And these, in turn, shape and are shaped by the alliance dynamics. And finally, sort of on this diagram, sort of on the sides of this set of layers, you have the internal alignment for both alliance members. See, this is exactly what we've been talking about and the need to create internal communication and maintain it and drive it forward. Potentially, there can be more than two members in an alliance. So this framework becomes multidimensional. But we don't need to get into that kind of detail right now.
Sounds a little bit confusing. I think I need to understand a bit better what he means by all of these.
Well, let's go over them briefly. The strategic imperative is the why. If anybody here is familiar with Simon Sinek, this is it. This is why you do it. This is the why the allies come together in the first place. The rationale. The alliance needs to have a vision, mission, and strategy. So Ard-Pieter asks us to look at it as a distinct business entity. This is an interesting thing. Like, even if it's not a joint venture, and there can be different types of alliances contractually and formally, but even if you just think, okay, we're just working with those people, why do we have to have a joint mission? This can be transformative to the way you work together and to the results that you achieve. There also needs to be a value proposition for both the allies and the alliance's clients. Finally, there needs to be some idea of scope, ideally with the understanding that the scope can evolve and the mechanisms to support that evolution. So you should be able to get feedback from the market, from your clients, from the environment, and evolve the scope of what you're doing. You could start doing less than what you've been doing, or more, or decide that you don't need to change. And the formal building blocks include the financial model. It is based on costs, revenues, profits, how these will be distributed, for example. Legal structure, if there is one. Decision-making, and in fact, I would say the absence of a legal contract is also some kind of a structure. It should be a conscious decision that you make. The decision-making mechanisms, who makes them, and how are they decided on. Organizational structure, including communication channels, reporting, planning, and control. Competition clauses, and importantly, the exit agreement. It is way too often, also in my own personal experience, that we don't think sufficiently about, well, we don't think sufficiently in advance at least, about how and under what conditions we will be able to bring the partnership to a close on good terms. So the informal ones, the mechanisms to finish this, the informal ones are also numerous, and this is all becoming a bit of a listicle, just listing things. I mean, which ones would you call out as the most important informal mechanisms of an alliance? And while you're thinking, I encourage our listeners to also leave some ideas in the comments.
Let me think. It's hard. It's really hard because when you start thinking, it seems like everything is important to this or that extent. While I was listening to you, it came to my mind that the book could be just boiled down to, hey there, if you want to make a successful alliance, just keep in mind what you want to achieve and why you want to achieve that goal and why the alliance can help you. Am I right?
I think that sounds like a tweet, and we should maybe suggest it to Ard-Pieter to just kind of go out there and say, well, my book that's many pages long. I just summarized it in 140 characters.
I don't want to say something bad about the book. It's really big. It contains a lot of useful information. I just want to make sure that I understood it in a correct way.
I mean, he tries to go into the mechanisms and help us learn what works and what doesn't. But I think the beginning, definitely, right? What you're saying, what you're summarizing here is what he's trying to emphasize very strongly. Like, if you're getting into an alliance, absolutely, this is the things you must consider. Why you're doing it and who you're doing it with, and you need to understand it really well.
Okay, let's go back to the informal mechanisms. What are your ideas on that point?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, my favorite one, let's put it this way, I don't know if it's the most important one, but my favorite one that has helped me tremendously in many situations has been personal relationships. It's not always possible to develop those, and it's not always necessary. I recognize this. However, for me, this has been very rewarding to create a deep personal relationship with the people that I work with on the other side and start treating them as something that enriches us both and where we can learn from each other and really grow. And almost as a pleasant bonus on top of it, the actual alliance that we're building also benefits from that.
That's why it was so nice working with you back then.
It's very kind of you to say it, and I'm very happy to hear it. But I can say the same, and this is why I find pleasure in this work. Also, I would say that I'm a big believer in informal mechanisms. Without effective informal ties, the formal ones for me aren't worth the paper they're written on, or whatever, the virtual paper, the electronic paper that they're written on. The best you can do, if the formal mechanisms are broken, you can litigate. You can take somebody to court. But the informal ones can make or break an alliance.
Informal mechanisms are really important because companies don't befriend each other, people do.
Indeed, right? And at the end of the day, that's what matters. If you disagree, please do so. Or if you agree, both. Leave it in the comments. Well, we're looking forward to the discussion. Anyway, talking about structure, there's another concept that stood out to me and will probably stand out to our audience as well. You remember how Mark, in his Partnernomics, talks about lone rangers versus hunters and farmers?
Right. That's his way to describe partner managers who manage the full relationship cycle versus those who create the partnership and those who lead it to success.
And if you don't know what we're talking about, you can go and listen to one of our previous episodes that covers Partnernomics. So apparently the Lone Ranger image is too strong to pass by in this world of partnerships and alliances, so Ard-Pieter gives it his own twist.
In what way?
In his framework, Lone Rangers are alliance managers on either side who are responsible for alliance management end to end. They interface with their counterparts at their line organization and also with all the relevant stakeholders internally.
That sounds very familiar.
Right? I think when you and I work together, that's very much the way we operate. The other option that Ard-Pieter proposes is the mirror model. So we've got Lone Rangers and then whatever he calls them, and then the mirror model, where every role at one partner is mirrored by someone at the other partner or partners. For example, for each PM, there's a corresponding PM. For each team lead or a director, there's a peer on the other side.
Well, on the first hand, it seems that it can get messy and confusing pretty fast. On the other hand, well, maybe there is something.
Look, I agree. There is that danger, so we need to be conscious of it, I suppose, when choosing between the two models or when, finding some sort of a balance between the two extremes. But what it does sound great for is for creating really closely bound and aligned lines. Like imagine if we're talking about an integration of the products and the PMs responsible for that are actually talking to each other about the details. That could be really useful.
Well, maybe he's right because, for example, when I try to remember some cases when I was an alliance manager or a project manager, I think it is more important just to organize the communication between relevant people. For example, a developer on the one side and a developer on the other side, they could understand each other much better than I can passing just information from one person to another, just like not effective because they can communicate together in a more efficient way. I as an alliance manager or as a project manager just is responsible for creating a reliable channel and organizing this process of communication.
Yeah, exactly. And because, well, there we go. So I think when we're talking about this kind of setup, on the one hand, these people speak each other's languages, both proverbially and maybe directly. At the same time, they can also misunderstand each other in spectacular ways because communication apparently is hard. So I guess it's the alliance manager's responsibility to kind of stay on top of that communication flow and come in to disambiguate and help people understand each other without miscommunications. All right, we have just a few aspects left to cover. We're getting to the end of it, we promise. Now that we've talked about structure, we should mention what Ard-Pieter has to say about alliance types. And there's a few. First, there is the evolution of suppliers into allies. According to Ard-Pieter, these emerge when innovation and flexibility become more important than short-term cost savings. I hope that makes sense, right? When you've been just acquiring products from somebody, but then you feel like you should actually be working together more closely, it just evolves naturally. Then we have contractual alliances, which Ard-Pieter refers to as the most flexible form. I don't know if I fully agree with that. However, that's his opinion. Whatever form these contracts might take, apparently they really exploded in the early 2000s, especially in IT. We've probably seen some of that. Then you have virtual joint ventures, which are best exemplified by airline alliances. And I think most people are quite familiar with those. They benefit from the adjacency of their markets, creating better routes, but not much more. But basically, you can just travel around easier within the same alliance. So that virtual bit reflects no mutual equity participation. That's why they're virtual joint ventures. And you can also therefore have equity alliances. Both subtypes are generally better to build on economies of scale and garnering market power than to generate intellectual property, for example, by doing R&D together. And finally, promise, Ard-Pieter thinks that in IT in particular, which is where we come to our tech alliances, the need to combine technologies to work on standardization and interoperability has led to the explosion of multi-partner alliances. He doesn't mention this explicitly, but I think it's especially interesting to observe this trend in open source software development, which could be, Maryna, for you and I, could be a subject of a whole different episode in and of itself.
Well, that's a lot. I mean, this guy is really into typologies and structures. I don't mean anything bad. I like structures. They help to understand important things.
I think, yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, what do you expect from an academic? But I'm only kidding. I think it's helpful because for us in the applied world, sometimes it becomes quite difficult to understand, especially if you're stuck on something or if you're trying to get to the next stage. It's quite hard to visualize all the different elements of what you might be in the middle of. Anyway, so that's why I think it's helpful and certainly got me thinking about both the evolution and the nature of multi-partner alliances a lot. In fact, Ard-Pieter himself dedicates the entire last chapter to discussing open alliances and the so-called third generation of collaboration. And remember, this was written about 10 years ago. He sees that as an evolution of multi-partner and predicts rapid growth for this type of alliances. And now, in 2023, he seems to have been very much on the ball. That's exactly the path that things have taken, especially in IT.
Wait, we've recorded a few episodes like with book reviews. It was Partnernomics, it was a handbook, and the alliances that we're talking about today. All these books are different and they're the same because they cover the same topic, alliances. Why all of these books are important to be read? I just want to stress out this for our listeners to understand why we are doing all these book reviews. Well, to my mind is that Partnernomics helps you to understand how alliances work, like it gives you a bigger picture. It has a very simple language. Yeah, it talks to the reader in a very simple language and it's easy to understand and digest. On the same side, the handbook is very long and it covers a lot of different details and it has a lot of theoretical things about alliances and about alliance managers. If we talk about alliances by Ard-Pieter, I think that he gives a very nice picture from the academic point of view how alliances work.
I think you gave a very good assessment of how they're all different in their perspectives. And that's probably the critical piece, the critical reason why you and I are doing these reviews and trying to spread the word. It is quite possible, and you and I have definitely been doing this for a while, to engage in alliance management and partnerships management without this foundational framework. However, as you get deeper into the field and as you spend more time working in this area, you start to feel the need to, well, I can't find a better word than to categorize the relationships and the partnerships that you're building because they all might be somewhat different depending on the goals, depending on the type of partner that you're engaging with. And all these books give us different perspectives and different ways of creating that structure, of creating that organization inside our heads, I suppose. It doesn't mean that you have to follow any one of them as a guide. We'll come to something called the Alliance Field Book, I hope, in one of our future episodes, which I suppose aims to be an instruction manual almost for alliance creation. And that's also quite useful and can come in quite handy. But even in the absence of a field book, these kind of theoretical and practical and more pragmatic approaches, they all give us something to be able to identify really what the next best step could look like.
Thank you, it was a perfect explanation, I think. Okay. Well, I think we can just wrap up the episode then. Oh, do you want to add something?
Not really. I think we've covered everything we wanted to discuss. Really curious, as I said before, to hear your feedback on informal and formal mechanisms and how you've been implementing them in your work. And very curious to see how many of you listening to us are actually engaged in open alliances, either in the field of open source or other types of open alliances. It's a fascinating field of exploration. It's exploding at the moment. It's hitting, it had its highs and lows, but I think it's definitely on the up and growing. So tell us more about it, and we'll certainly be coming back to the subject in future episodes.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed the review of Alliances by Ard-Pieter de Man.
Exactly. Many thanks to our listeners. We do hope you enjoyed today's talk, and please subscribe. Find us wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget to follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn to stay tuned. Links are below.
Catch you next time on the tap.